there's so much more in this story about Jesus up on the mountain with his disciples than what you're going to get out of it by just reading it through one time. But you can learn to recognize these details in any Bible story, and that's what we're going to do together today. I need a haircut bad. The longer it gets, the more gray you can see. I hope you guys are surviving the quarantine. My last video was just too long. I'm sorry. I just wanted to summarize some of the things that I've learned about narrative analysis. I don't know if you made it all the way through that video or not. But today what I want to do is go through a single story, and we'll apply those 4 elements of narrative analysis. And by the end, you're going to get a lot more out of this story than what you did the first time we read it through together. I hope you're ready to jump into the Bible with me today. Let's get stuck in. So let's read our text together. It's in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. And as you read it along with me, try to understand what is the main point that Luke wants to get across to us by telling this story. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. And as he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. So the first element of narrative analysis that I want to go through here, now that we've read the text through for the first time, we've gotten our first impressions, let's consider the settings and the props. What does Luke tell us about where the story takes place and any props that are used that are significant for the story? So first of all, I notice he says that about 8 days after these sayings. So he's telling us when the story takes place. For our purposes, that can be considered part of the setting. And then he tells us that they went up on the mountain to pray. This is the more significant element. This is physically where the story takes place. He does make mention in verse 31 to Jerusalem, but that's something that takes place outside of this story. The only prop that is mentioned is the cloud. They entered the cloud in verse 34, and then in verse 35, the voice came out of the cloud. So the most significant thing that we can identify from our evaluation of settings and props is that Luke tells us that this takes place up on the mountain. And we'll come back to that a little bit later as we progress through our study of this passage. Overall, there's not a lot of major revelations here regarding the main point of the story. So let's go ahead and consider characters in this story. What can we learn from what Luke tells us about the characters? So first of all, let's identify who the characters are. We have, of course, Jesus. That's he in this story right at the beginning. We have his 3 disciples, Peter, John, and James, whom he has taken with him. Then there's the appearance of 2 figures, Moses and Elijah. And then finally, as we come to the conclusion of the story, there is a voice that comes out of the cloud. It's obvious in this case that this is the voice of God or God the Father. So out of all the characters that are in this story, which ones get the most attention? Which ones are described the most? Which ones seem to be most significant to the story that Luke is telling here? There are 2 that stand out really above all of the others, and that would be Peter and Jesus. So let's notice, first of all, what Luke tells us about Peter. Peter is mentioned right at the beginning along with John and James. And then when we come down to verse 32, it says, Peter and those who were with him. So Peter stands out from the other disciples. All of them had fallen asleep, but Peter is the one mentioned by name. They became fully awake and saw the two men standing with Jesus. And then Peter is the one who speaks. So Peter said to Jesus, he doesn't know what he says, really. He's just blabbering, basically. So of the three disciples, Peter is the one most in focus. His actual speech is recorded here in the story, and you can tell that Luke is putting the focus on Peter over the other two disciples. But now let's notice all of the descriptions that we're given about Jesus, how he's described and the things that he does. So it says, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Jesus seems to be the primary actor in that case. It says, as he was praying, so we see it's described that he was praying. And then it says, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. So there's some extra description about Jesus' appearance here in this section. Moses and Elijah are speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So a lot of description about who Jesus is, what he's doing, what his purpose is. And then significantly, when we come down toward the end of this story, in verse 35, the voice comes out of the cloud and it says, this is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. So that's a pretty significant event that the voice of God is speaking here in this story, describing Jesus, my son, my chosen one, listen to him. So it's elevating Jesus in this story, glorifying him. And then at the conclusion, Jesus was found alone. And so there's a return back to the original state. So I think clearly with all of the description that we see about Jesus especially, but the other characters as well, this is likely to be the most fruitful part of our study here, and where the focus really seems to be is on the characters, particularly on Jesus, who he is, what he's going to do, his relationship to the disciples and to God. The next thing that we want to pay attention to in this story to understand Luke's point and what he wants to get across to us is the actions, the events that take place in this story. How does Luke describe them? Well, let's take a look at that here. It begins with this travel up the mountain to pray. Jesus goes into prayer. Notice that Luke doesn't mention anything about the disciples falling asleep at this point. As Jesus is praying, the appearance of his face was altered. His clothing became dazzling white. So there's some extra description there about Jesus' appearance being changed. And then two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory. They spoke of his departure. And then there is a reference to his departure, which he's about to accomplish, so something that takes place outside of this story. At that point, Peter and the others had been sleeping, and they became fully awake. They saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And so the men are getting ready to depart, and Peter begins to speak then, but he doesn't know what he's saying, so Luke does describe a little bit, with a little bit of extra detail, how Peter doesn't even understand what he's talking about, basically. And then, of course, this cloud comes and overshadows them, and they become afraid as they enter the cloud. And then the voice speaks out of the cloud. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. So another description of Jesus' appearance, his being alone now. Those other two visitors had gone. And then the disciples kept silent, and they told no one about what they'd seen. So where is the focus in this passage on the events? There may be some focus on Jesus' transformation or his transfiguration, maybe some focus on the disciples' lack of understanding, but that would probably be about it as far as the actions, the events are concerned. So finally, let's consider the plot of this story and what we can learn about Luke's intentions from the way that he develops the plot over the course of this story. Normally, at the beginning of the story, we expect to find some problem that needs to be resolved by the time we arrive at the end of the story. In this case, that's a little bit ambiguous. What really is the problem right at the beginning? It's not quite clear. But as we consider the story as a whole, it becomes clear that this story really is about revealing who Jesus is, what his mission is, what his relationship is to God. We do see this developed early in the story as Jesus' appearance. It says the appearance of his face was altered, his clothing becomes dazzling white, and then these two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. So Jesus' divine identity is being developed here. We see it developed a little bit more when the disciples wake up and they saw his glory. And as they begin to leave, Peter begins to speak, but we're told that he didn't know even what he was saying. And then it comes to the climax here when the cloud overshadowed them and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And then finally, really the climax here when the voice speaks out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." So then finally the plot is resolved at the end when Jesus is found alone again, and then when the disciples kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. So as we consider the plot of this story, I think it's best in this case to recognize that this story is part of a larger plot that takes place across the whole book of Luke. And in this case, Jesus is approaching the time of his crucifixion. He knows that his time on earth is coming to a close. There may be some doubt or some ambiguity about his own understanding of his mission, certainly about the disciples' understanding of his mission and their understanding of his identity. And so we fit this story into that larger framework. This story also reminds us that even the Gospels are part of the larger story of the whole Bible. Notice these two Old Testament prophets, Moses and Elijah. They seem to represent those who have walked the path that Jesus is now on, but they have completed their work. And it's interesting to note a couple parallels to both of their stories that we find in the way that Luke tells this story. Notice that he mentions specifically to us that this takes place up on a mountain. There's a voice of God that speaks there to the disciples, to Jesus. And both Moses and Elijah had an experience very similar to this one that Jesus is experiencing in this story. Moses, of course, in the book of Exodus, went up on Mount Sinai. He spoke there with God. All of the Israelites heard the voice of God speak on the top of Mount Sinai. Elijah as well fled after the showdown on Mount Carmel. He found himself on top of a mountain where God came to him, and he heard God in the still small voice that whispered to him there. So the Gospels are not a story in and of themselves. They are part of this larger story of the whole Bible. And here Jesus is preparing to play a significant role in the climax of that great story. So just to summarize now what we've gathered in doing this bit of narrative analysis, the characterization of Jesus that we see here, the description of his figure changing, the appearance of Moses and Elijah, the voice of God speaking, all of that comes together to make the strong point, I think, that this story is really about Jesus, his identity, his mission and his work, and then his relationship with his disciples and their understanding of who he is. So how then should we apply this story to our own lives? Here's the point that I take away from this. Jesus is not in this story depicted merely as a good teacher, merely as a revolutionary within Judaism or within the Roman Empire. He's not even merely a miracle worker or a healer. Jesus is a divine being. That's how he's depicted in this story. When Jesus speaks, it's significant. When he gives me instruction through his word, that has an authority in my life. And so I want to remember who Jesus really is and what he did for me. Okay, that does it for our study today of this story. I sure hope that you were blessed by it and that it makes a little bit more sense now how to do some of this very simple narrative analysis. If you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up down below, and I sure hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel If you want to see the full, more in-depth tutorial on how to do narrative analysis with a few other examples, you can just click on this video right over here. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.